When Shaquille O'Neal steps in to help a struggling family, he uncovers a web of greed, corruption, and power that runs deeper than he ever imagined. But in a city where money rules and the rich rewrite the rules, can one man take on the system and win? Betrayals will surface, secrets will unravel, and karma will come knocking. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The city never truly sleeps. It moves like a restless tide, neon lights flickering against the damp pavement, car horns blaring in frustration, and the distant hum of voices blending into an urban symphony. It's a place where ambition thrives, where dreams are both made and broken, and where the weight of struggle presses down on those who have the least. Among the towering buildings and chaotic streets, one figure stands out, not because of his size, though he is undeniably larger than life, but because of the warmth he carries within him. Shaquille O'Neal, or Big Shaq as the neighborhood calls him, is a man with a presence that commands attention. Not in an intimidating way, but in the way a lighthouse commands a sailor's trust in the middle of a storm. Shaq has lived through it all, the fame, the wealth, the pressure, but deep inside, he has never let the world harden him. Despite everything, he still believes in people. He believes in helping where help is needed, lifting up those who have fallen, and being the kind of man his mother raised him to be. It's why he spends his mornings walking through the very streets he once played on as a child, checking in on old friends, greeting the kids who look up at him with wide eyes, and making sure no one gets left behind in the city's cold shadows. But not everyone shares Shaq's heart. In the heart of this city, power belongs to men who count their wealth in properties, not in lives they've changed. Men who own blocks, not homes. Men like Vincent Holloway. Vincent is a name whispered with resentment in the community. He is the kind of man who sees poverty as an opportunity and misfortune as a business model. If a family can't pay rent, evict them. If someone falls behind, charge extra fees. No mercy, no second chances. And now, Vincent has set his sights on a small, struggling apartment complex at the edge of the city. One of the last places where working-class families can still afford a roof over their heads. Shaq first notices the family outside a rundown corner store, their belongings packed into cheap suitcases. The weight of the world pressing on the mother's tired shoulders. She clutches the hands of her two children, one barely old enough to understand what's happening, the other old enough to feel the sting of humiliation. Her name is Lena Carter, and she has lived in the city long enough to know that once you fall, there's no safety net to catch you. She works 2 jobs, yet somehow, it's never enough. One missed paycheck was all it took for Vincent's notice to land on her door. Shaq watches as Lena tries to hold it together, offering her kids a reassuring smile she doesn't truly feel. His chest tightens. He's seen this before, he's lived it. He remembers what it was like when his mother struggled, when eviction notices felt like a ticking time bomb, when survival was a daily battle. He won't stand by and watch it happen to someone else. He walks over, his towering frame casting a shadow over the small family. But when Lena looks up at him, she doesn't see a stranger. She recognizes him immediately, not just as the basketball legend, but as the man who's always around, always helping, always giving. Shaq crouches to the kids' level, offering them the kind of smile that makes everything feel a little less scary. "Y'all good?" he asks softly. The little boy nods hesitantly, gripping his sister's hand. But Lena doesn't answer. She doesn't trust Charity. She's been burned too many times by false promises and empty words. She straightens her spine, her pride clashing against her desperation. "We'll figure it out," she says, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Shaq nods, understanding. "I know you will," he says. "But you don't gotta do it alone." Lena exhales slowly, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Shaq doesn't push. Instead, he stands pulling out his phone. He makes a call, to his lawyer, to the people who can fight battles where he can't. Then he makes another call. This time, to Vincent Holloway. Vincent answers with an air of arrogance, as if he already knows what Shaq is about to say. "I appreciate the concern, big guy," he drawls, "but business is business." Shaq's jaw tightens. "You got a family out here, Vincent, a mother with kids. You don't see a problem with that?" I see a tenant who didn't pay her dues, Vincent replies smoothly. And I see a property I could be making a hell of a lot more money on once I clear out the dead weight. Shaq inhales deeply, holding back the frustration building inside him. I'll cover her rent. Whatever she owes, I'll pay it. Vincent chuckles, and the sound makes Shaq's stomach turn. That's sweet, but no. Silence. Shaq grips the phone tighter. What do you mean, no? I mean, I don't take charity, Vincent says, his voice oozing mockery. And I don't let people like you tell me how to run my business. People like him. Shaq clenches his teeth, knowing exactly what Vincent means without him having to say it outright. It's the same old story. The powerful keeping their power, the wealthy refusing to let anyone else breathe. Vincent sighs dramatically. Listen, I'm sure you mean well, but there's nothing to discuss. Lena Carter and her kids will be off my property by morning. End of story. The call ends. Shaq stares at his phone, the anger simmering beneath his skin. But anger won't help Lena. Action will. He looks back at the family, at the way Lena is trying so hard to be strong for her kids. He knows this battle won't be won in a single night, and it won't be won with just money. It's about something bigger than a single family. It's about justice. Shaq straightens his shoulders. If Vincent thinks this is the end of the story, he's dead wrong. Because Shaq has never been the kind of man to walk away from a fight, especially when the fight is about doing what's right. And Vincent Holloway is about to learn that some battles can't be won with money. This is just the beginning. Vincent Holloway didn't build his empire. He inherited it. He was born into wealth, raised in privilege, and conditioned to believe that money wasn't just power. It was everything. His father, a real estate tycoon, taught him that emotions were for the weak, that sympathy was a liability, and that success meant owning people, not just properties. Now, decades later, Vincent had perfected the art of cold-hearted business. To the outside world, he was an astute businessman, a real estate mogul who revitalized neighborhoods. But those who lived in the shadows of his towering buildings knew the truth. Vincent Holloway was a predator in a suit. A man who didn't just evict tenants, he erased them. He sat in his high-rise office, sipping a finely aged scotch, overlooking a city he considered his chessboard. Below, lives were being uprooted, families displaced, and dreams shattered, all at his command. He called it urban renewal. Others called it greed in its purest form. As his assistant entered the room, he barely glanced up. "What's next?" he asked, his voice smooth but disinterested. "The Carter eviction, sir. They're refusing to leave," she replied, sliding a folder onto his desk. Vincent smirked, flipping it open. He knew all about Lena Carter, a single mother working 2 jobs, barely scraping by. He had given her a final notice weeks ago. If she couldn't keep up, she didn't deserve to stay. His assistant hesitated. Shaquille O'Neal was seen talking to her earlier today. That made Vincent pause. He shut the folder and leaned back, intrigued. "Big Shaq?" he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Yes, sir. He offered to cover her rent." Vincent chuckled, swirling his drink. Of course he did. He had seen Shaq's type before, the do-gooders, the saviors, the men who thought money could fix anything. But Vincent knew better. Money was a tool, a weapon, and it was meant to be used for control, not compassion. "Get me O'Neal on the phone," he said. Within minutes, the call connected. Shaq's voice was steady, calm, but there was a quiet force behind it. "Vincent." "Big Shaq," Vincent replied, a smirk playing on his lips. "What can I do for you?" "I'm calling about Lena Carter. Whatever she owes, I'll pay it. Just let her stay." Vincent leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. He could hear the sincerity in Shaq's voice, but sincerity meant nothing to him. "You know, Shaq," he drawled, "I respect a man who knows how to throw his weight around. But I don't run a charity." "I'm not asking for charity," Shaq said, his voice firm. "I'm offering you money. Name your price." Vincent laughed under his breath. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about money. It's about control. If I let one person slide, the whole damn building starts thinking they can do the same. And then what? I have a community of freeloaders." Shaq's patience thinned. "She's got 2 kids, Vincent. And that's not my problem," Vincent said flatly. She signed a contract. She didn't pay. End of discussion. Shaq exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his voice. You want money? I'll buy the whole damn building. Just tell me your number. Vincent grinned, shaking his head. This was what he had been waiting for, the moment where he could remind Shaquille O'Neal that even money has its limits. You still think money makes you powerful, he said. But real power is being able to say no, even when someone throws a fortune at your feet. And my answer, Shaq, is no. Silence. Vincent could hear Shaq breathing on the other end, hear the way the anger was simmering just below the surface. But Shaq wasn't the type to explode. He was too controlled, too calculated. That's what made this even more entertaining. Why? Shaq asked finally. Vincent took another slow sip of his drink. Because I don't like being told what to do. And because I don't do favors for men like you. There it was. The venom beneath the charm. The unspoken truth hanging in the air. Shaq tightened his grip on the phone. He had spent his entire life breaking barriers, proving people wrong, refusing to be limited by the color of his skin or the stereotypes others placed on him. But men like Vincent didn't change. I'll find another way, Shaq said, his voice dangerously low. Vincent smirked. You're welcome to try. But by tomorrow morning, Lena Carter will be on the street, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. The call ended. Vincent set his phone down, the amusement still dancing in his eyes. He loved this game. He loved watching powerful men realize they weren't as powerful as they thought. But what Vincent didn't realize, what he never considered, was that some people didn't play for power. Some people played for justice. And Big Shaq wasn't done playing yet. Shaq sat in the back of his SUV, his broad hands folded together, his mind turning over the conversation with Vincent Holloway. There was something about the landlord's refusal that didn't sit right. Vincent was rich, yes, but every rich man had a price. Yet, he had rejected Shaq's offer, not because of money, but because of control. That meant there was something bigger at play. The city had always been a battlefield between those who built it and those who exploited it. Shaq had seen it happen before. Low-income families pushed out, entire blocks erased under the name of progress. The cycle was always the same. First, rent hikes. Then, forced evictions. And before anyone could fight back, a shiny new development rose in place of the homes that once stood. Shaq knew this wasn't just about Lena Carter. This was about power, greed, and a system designed to keep people like her losing. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Within minutes, he was on the line with Daniel Ricks, an old friend who had built a reputation as one of the city's best investigative reporters. If there was corruption, Daniel would find it. Shaq. Daniel's voice came through the line, calm and sharp. What's going on? I need you to dig into Vincent Holloway, Shaq said, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. He's evicting a single mother and her kids, and something about it feels off. He refused to let me pay her rent. Daniel let out a low whistle. Vincent refusing money. That's not just greed. That's a strategy. That's what I'm thinking, Shaq said. Can you find out what's really going on? Daniel was quiet for a moment, then exhaled. I'll see what I can pull. But Shaq, if Vincent's got something bigger planned, he's not doing it alone. Guys like him have connections. You ready to go up against that? Shaq's jaw tightened. Yeah, I am. 2 days later, Shaq met Daniel at an old diner on the east side of the city. The place was nearly empty, the kind of spot where people talked in hushed tones, and waitresses knew when not to ask questions. Daniel slid a folder across the table. You were right. This isn't just an eviction. It's a full-scale operation. Shaq flipped open the folder. Inside were documents, city permits, and blueprints, all leading to one undeniable truth. Vincent Holloway wasn't just clearing out tenants. He was making way for something bigger. A high-rise development, Daniel explained. Luxury apartments, corporate offices, the works. He's been planning this for over a year. He's already bought out most of the block, but there's one thing standing in his way. Shaq's eyes flicked up. Lena's building. Daniel nodded. It's one of the last properties with rent-controlled units. If he gets rid of the tenants, he can demolish it and start construction. But there's more. He tapped a document. This project isn't just Vincent's idea. The city's involved. Shaq narrowed his eyes. How deep? Daniel hesitated. Deep. Mayor's office. Zoning board. A few high-ranking officials. They all stand to make a fortune if this goes through. Shaq exhaled, leaning back in his seat. It was worse than he thought. Vincent wasn't just evicting families. He was erasing a community. And the people who were supposed to protect these families? They were lining their own pockets instead. So, what's the timeline? Shaq asked. Daniel pulled out another document. The final approvals go through in 3 weeks. If he clears out the building before then, nothing can stop the project. Lena's eviction is the last piece of the puzzle. Shaq clenched his fists. This wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about exposing the system that let this happen. And he only had days to do it. Shaq spent the next 24 hours making calls, pulling strings, and rallying the people who still believed in justice. He met with civil rights lawyers, housing advocates, and local activists. Anyone who could help. They all told him the same thing. Fighting this wouldn't be easy. The city had already rubber-stamped Vincent's plans. The courts. They were slow. By the time any legal action happened, Lena and every other tenant would be long gone. He needed another way. That's when he called Renee Caldwell, one of the toughest housing attorneys in the city. She met him at a late-night cafe, her eyes sharp behind thick glasses, her no-nonsense attitude cutting through the noise. "You can't stop the eviction," she said, flipping through the documents Shaq had handed her. Legally, Vincent's covered every base, but... She glanced up. "You can slow him down." Shaq leaned in. "How?" Renee smirked. "Paperwork, technicalities, delays. You flood his office with enough legal pushback. He can't move forward without risk. The trick is buying time." Shaq exhaled. "How much time?" "Maybe a couple of weeks, enough to get the public's attention." She studied him. "You're not just trying to stop one eviction, are you?" Shaq shook his head. "Number, I want to take the whole thing down." Renee nodded. "Then you need more than legal action. You need a public fight." The next morning, Shaq stood outside Lena's building. The news cameras were rolling. He had called every journalist he knew, every media outlet that still cared about real stories. The people of the city needed to see this. They needed to see what was happening to their neighbors. Lena stood beside him, exhausted but determined. Around them, other tenants gathered, men, women, children, all afraid, all holding on to the only homes they had left. Shaq stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about one family. This is about every family being pushed out of their homes so the rich can get richer. Vincent Holloway thinks he can erase this community. He thinks we won't fight back." He looked into the cameras. He's wrong. The crowd erupted in cheers, in chants, in defiance. Across the city, people watched, and the pressure on Vincent began to rise. Vincent Holloway was in his office when the news broke. He watched the broadcast in silent rage, his fingers tightening around his glass of whiskey. Shaquille O'Neal had just turned a simple eviction into a public war, and Vincent wasn't about to lose. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "It's time," Vincent said. "Pull every favor we have. I want Shaq out of this." A pause. Then, "You sure?" Vincent's eyes darkened. "I don't lose," he said. "Not to him. Not to anyone." The restaurant was one of those high-end, members-only places where power didn't just sit at the tables, it ran the entire room. A quiet symphony of murmured deals and expensive wine filled the air, the kind of place where men like Vincent Holloway thrived. Shaq wasn't impressed. He had arranged this meeting with one goal in mind, to give Vincent one last chance to do the right thing. He wasn't here to argue, to plead, or to fight a battle of egos. He was here to solve a problem before it turned into something neither of them could control. Vincent arrived late, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, his signature smirk already in place. He moved like a man who believed the world revolved around him, like someone who had never lost a fight that mattered. He slid into the booth across from Shaq, sighing dramatically as he unbuttoned his jacket. "Big Shaq," he drawled, waving down the waiter without even looking at him. "You do realize this is a waste of time, right?" Shaq ignored the arrogance in his tone. He had dealt with men like Vincent before, entitled Ruthless Untouchable. But no one was untouchable. "Let's get straight to it," Shaq said. "I'm offering you a deal, one that works for both of us." Vincent chuckled, amused at the idea. "And what exactly do you think you have that I want?" Shaq pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were investment opportunities, business expansions, and a direct partnership with some of the biggest real estate developers in the country. Deals that would triple Vincent's wealth in less than 5 years. "Walk away from the Carter eviction," Shaq said. "Keep the building, keep the tenants, and I'll bring you into something bigger. You win. The city wins." Vincent flipped through the papers, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow exhale, he leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers against the table. "Interesting," he admitted. "Generous, even." His eyes flicked up to Shaq, sharp with amusement, but completely unnecessary. Shaq's jaw tightened. "Meaning?" Vincent pushed the folder aside. "Meaning I don't need your money. I already own this city. And I don't take deals from men who don't understand how the game is played." Shaq's patience was wearing thin. "This isn't a game, Vincent." "Oh, but it is," Vincent said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And you? You don't even know the rules." He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make the words sting. "You think kindness is power. You think helping people makes you stronger. But it doesn't. It makes you a target." He smirked. "You still don't get it, do you?" Shaq clenched his fists under the table. "Get what?" Vincent chuckled softly. "I didn't just refuse your offer because I could. I refused it because I wanted to." He let the words sink in before continuing. "I want you to watch. I want you to see what happens when a man like you tries to stand in the way of a man like me." Shaq inhaled deeply, controlling the frustration building inside him. He wasn't here for an argument. He was here for a solution. But Vincent wasn't interested in solutions. He was interested in humiliation. A waiter arrived, placing a glass of red wine in front of Vincent. The landlord picked it up, swirling the liquid slowly. "Now, if you're done pretending we're equals," he said, his smirk widening, "you can leave." But Shaq didn't move. His gaze locked onto Vincent's, unshaken, unwavering. "You ever hear the saying, pride comes before the fall?" Vincent took a slow sip of his wine. "I don't fall, Shaq." Shaq pushed his chair back, standing to his full height. "We'll see about that." And with that, he walked out. Vincent wasn't done yet. By the time Shaq made it back to his car, his phone was already buzzing. News alerts, social media mentions, videos going viral. He clicked on the first link. There, plastered all over the internet, was a leaked video of their meeting. The camera was positioned just right, capturing Vincent's smug confidence and Shaq's serious demeanor. But the editing was brutal. It cut out all the real conversation, leaving only Vincent's taunts and Shaq's silence. The caption? Shaquille O'Neal loses public battle against Vincent Holloway. Shaq exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about making a scene. This was calculated. Vincent had set this up from the start. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Big Shaq humiliated in failed negotiation. Vincent Holloway schools Shaquille O'Neal in ruthless business move. Is Shaq out of his league? The media had twisted the narrative, framing Shaq as a desperate, powerless celebrity trying to play hero and failing spectacularly. And Vincent? Vincent was basking in it. He gave a smug interview, painting Shaq as an emotional millionaire who doesn't understand real business. He laughed about the deal and called it a generous but misguided offer. Shaquille O'Neal is a great athlete, Vincent said into the cameras, but this is the real world, and in the real world, nice guys finish last. Shaq watched the interview from his office, jaw clenched. He wasn't angry about the hit to his reputation. He had been in the public eye long enough to know how the media worked. What angered him was what came next. Vincent had used the distraction of the media storm to move Lena's eviction date up. Instead of having days to fight back, she now had 24 hours. Shaq stood, his pulse steady, his mind racing. Vincent had made his move. Now, it was Shaq's turn. Shaq had always believed that money didn't change a man, it only revealed who he truly was. And if that was the case, then Vincent Holloway had never been a businessman. He had been a predator from the very beginning. The public humiliation from their last meeting didn't bother Shaq. What bothered him was how effortlessly Vincent had manipulated the system to accelerate Lena's eviction. The landlord hadn't just won a battle. He had made a statement. This wasn't about a single mother losing her home anymore. This was about power, control, and a system designed to keep people like Lena losing. Shaq knew that the only way to fight Vincent wasn't with money or influence. It was with the truth, and he needed to find it. Fast. Shaq sat across from Daniel Ricks again, this time in a dimly lit bar near the docks. The air smelled like sea salt and whiskey, and the conversations around them were spoken in low murmurs. It was the kind of place where secrets felt safe, even when they weren't. Daniel slid a flash drive across the table. I dug deeper, he said. Turns out this isn't Vincent's first time pulling something like this. Shaq picked up the drive. How bad is it? Daniel exhaled. Worse than we thought. He's been doing this for over a decade, buying out rent-controlled properties, driving out the tenants, mostly minorities, then flipping them into luxury high-rises. Shaq clenched his jaw. And no one's ever stopped him? Daniel gave him a pointed look. Shaq, he owns the system, the city council, zoning board, even judges, they're all in his pocket. Every legal complaint against him, dismissed. Every lawsuit, settled before it made headlines. He's untouchable. Shaq wasn't convinced. Nobody is untouchable, he muttered. Daniel hesitated before leaning in. There's one thing, he said quietly. One person, but it's complicated. Shaq raised a brow. Who? Daniel glanced around, lowering his voice. Marcus Tate. Shaq frowned. Never heard of him. You wouldn't have, Daniel replied. He was one of Vincent's top guys, helped him run things from the inside. But a few years ago, something changed. He quit, disappeared. No one knows why. Shaq's mind was already working. Where is he now? Daniel sighed. That's the problem. He doesn't want to be found. It took 6 hours, 3 phone calls, and a favor from an old friend, but Shaq finally got an address. Marcus Tate was holed up in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where people checked in when they didn't want to be found. Shaq pulled into the cracked parking lot and stepped out of his SUV. The neon vacancy sign buzzed weakly above him as he made his way to room 214. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. This time, the door cracked open just an inch. A pair of tired, wary eyes stared back at him. Marcus Tate? Shaq asked. Silence. Then the door started to close. Shaq caught it before it could shut. I know who you are, he said, voice calm but firm. I know what you used to do for Vincent Holloway, and I know why you ran. Marcus's grip on the door tightened. Then you know I can't help you, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq studied him. The man looked haunted, worn down, like someone carrying a weight that was too heavy for too long. You don't have to be afraid of him, Shaq said. Marcus let out a bitter laugh. You don't get it, do you? It's not just him. It's all of them. The whole damn system. He shook his head. You think you can take down Vincent Holloway? You think you can win? Shaq didn't blink. I don't need to win, he said. I just need to expose the truth. Marcus hesitated. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something that looked a lot like guilt. Whatever Vincent has on you, Shaq pressed, it's not worth the life you're living right now. Marcus exhaled shakily. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped back and opened the door. Come in, he said. The room was small, cluttered, and smelled like cheap air freshener trying to cover something worse. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing a hand over his face. You want to know the truth? He muttered. Fine. But you're not going to like it. Shaq leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Try me. Marcus inhaled deeply. Vincent doesn't just evict people. He ruins them. He doesn't just force them out. He makes sure they can't come back. Once a family's gone, their credit is destroyed. Their rental history is trashed. No landlord in the city will touch them. Shaq's stomach tightened. So they end up homeless. Marcus nodded. Or worse. Some move away, some disappear, Some don't make it. He looked down at his hands. That's why I left. I didn't sign up for this. I thought I was just flipping properties, making money. But when I realized what was really happening, how many lives we were wrecking, I couldn't do it anymore. Shaq was silent. He had expected corruption, expected greed. But this was something else. You have proof? He asked. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, I do. Shaq's pulse quickened. Then we take this to the press. Marcus let out a hollow laugh. You don't get it. If I go public, I'm dead. You think Vincent's just gonna let me walk free after this? He shook his head. I talk, and I end up like the others. Shaq frowned. What others? Marcus hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, the ones who tried to expose him before. A chill ran down Shaq's spine. Look, Marcus said, rubbing his temples. I want to help, but I can't. I won't. His voice broke slightly. I just want to stay alive. Shaq exhaled, pushing down his frustration. He couldn't force Marcus to talk. He wouldn't put the man in danger just to get what he needed. But that didn't mean he was giving up. Shaq stood. You don't have to go public, he said. Just give me what you have. Let me be the one to put the pressure on him. Marcus hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. I'll send you everything, he said. But after that, I'm gone. Shaq respected that. Fair enough. That night, Shaq sat in his office, staring at the files Marcus had sent over. It was all there. The fake lease agreements, the forced evictions, the under-the-table deals between Vincent and city officials. This was bigger than one man. This was an entire network of corruption. And now, Shaq had the proof. He picked up his phone and called Daniel. It's worse than we thought, he said. Daniel's voice was grim. Then we take this public. We make sure Vincent can't escape this time. Shaq's grip tightened on the phone. Let's do it. Shaq knew that bringing down a man like Vincent Holloway wasn't just about exposing him. It was about making sure the world paid attention. Vincent had built his empire on secrecy, on the silent suffering of families who had nowhere else to go. His power didn't just come from his wealth. It came from the fact that no one had ever dared to challenge him publicly. But Shaq wasn't just anyone. And he wasn't just going to challenge Vincent. He was going to crush him. It started with a single tweet. A black and white photo of Lena Carter and her 2 kids sitting outside the building they had just been evicted from, their belongings packed into garbage bags. Shaq's caption was simple. This is what greed looks like. This is what corruption does. Vincent Holloway is destroying lives for profit, and I won't stand by and let it happen. Justice for Lena. Stop Holloway. Within minutes, the post went viral. Thousands of retweets, celebrities chiming in, journalists picking up the story. The comment section flooded with outrage, with people demanding answers, demanding action. But Shaq didn't stop there. He reached out to every contact he had in the media, sports networks, talk shows, investigative journalists. He told them everything about Vincent's evictions, his ties to corrupt city officials, his hidden real estate deals. Within 24 hours, Vincent Holloway's name was everywhere. The news cycle had turned against him. Meanwhile, Shaq was working on something even bigger behind the scenes. Vincent had spent years making sure the legal system worked in his favor. He had the best lawyers, airtight contracts, and officials in his pocket. But every empire had a crack in the foundation. Shaq just had to find it. That's where Renee Caldwell came in, the sharpest housing attorney in the city, a woman who had spent her entire career fighting against landlords like Vincent. Shaq met her in a quiet law office late at night, the air thick with the weight of what they were about to do. She flipped through the documents Shaq had gotten from Marcus Tate, her brow furrowed in concentration. You weren't kidding, she muttered. This is some next-level corruption. Can we use it? Shaq asked. Renee tapped a particular page with her pen. Maybe. There's a clause here, buried in the contracts Vincent issued to his tenants. A tiny loophole. He's been pushing these evictions through under the claim that the properties need emergency repairs. Shaq frowned. And that means legally, he's supposed to provide alternate housing for displaced tenants. He hasn't done that, not once. That's illegal. Shaq exhaled. So, if we prove that, we can tie him up in court for months, maybe years, long enough to stop the evictions and kill his development deal. Renee leaned back, crossing her arms. Vincent thinks he's untouchable, but if we take this to a judge, he's going to have a legal nightmare on his hands. A slow grin spread across Shaq's face. That was exactly what he needed. The next morning, Vincent Holloway woke up to chaos. His name was splashed across every major news outlet. Protesters had gathered outside his office building, holding signs that read, "Stop the evictions. Holloway profits off our pain. Justice for our communities." His phone wouldn't stop ringing, reporters demanding comments, investors growing nervous. And then came the legal notice. A lawsuit, filed by Renee Caldwell and a group of displaced tenants, claiming Vincent had illegally forced people out of their homes without following the law. For the first time in years, Vincent Holloway wasn't in control. Shaq sat in his office, watching the chaos unfold on the news. He knew this wasn't over yet. Vincent was too powerful to go down without a fight. But this was the beginning of the end. And Shaq? He was just getting started. Vincent Holloway had spent years building his empire on silence. Silence from the families he forced out. Silence from the city officials he bought off. Silence from the media outlets that depended on his advertising dollars. But Shaq had broken that silence. And Vincent wasn't going to let that go unanswered. The first strike came fast and ruthless. By the time Shaq woke up the next morning, the narrative had already shifted. News anchors, social media influencers, and talk show hosts were all repeating the same script, painting Shaq as the villain. Shaquille O'Neal oversteps, threatens local businessman's right to develop his own property. Why is a multimillionaire meddling in housing politics? Is this just another celebrity stunt? Shaq watched the headlines roll in, his fists clenched. It wasn't just biased reporting. It was orchestrated. Vincent had flipped the script overnight, using his influence to turn Shaq's fight for justice into a media circus. And then came the real blow. The lawsuit Shaq had helped set in motion, the one that had given him the legal leverage to stall the evictions. It was dismissed. The judge, one of Vincent's longtime political allies, threw out the case, citing a lack of substantial evidence. Shaq exhaled sharply. He had expected Vincent to fight back, but not this quickly. And he wasn't done yet. By the end of the day, Vincent had doubled down. Protesters outside his office were met with cease and desist orders. News outlets that had reported on his corruption mysteriously retracted their stories. Even Shaq's own social media posts about Lena's eviction were suddenly flagged and removed. But the worst part? Lena was gone. Shaq arrived at the apartment complex that night, heart pounding as he scanned the empty lot where her belongings had been dumped like trash. A neighbor shook his head. They came at noon. No warning, no nothing. Packed up her stuff, put her in a car, and drove off. Shaq's stomach tightened. Who took her? The man hesitated. Some private security guys. Didn't look like cops. Vincent's men. Shaq's hands curled into fists. Vincent hadn't just evicted Lena. He had made her disappear. Hours later, Shaq sat in his office, staring at his phone. He had tried calling Lena, but her number had been disconnected. Vincent was making a statement. He wasn't just winning. He was erasing every trace of resistance. Shaq was about to call Daniel Ricks when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Hello? A low, familiar voice came through the line. You need to stop, Shaq. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Who is this? A pause. Then, it's Marcus. Shaq sat up straighter. The last time he had seen Marcus Tate, the former right-hand man to Vincent, the man had been terrified to even speak out. Now, he was calling him directly. What's going on? Shaq asked. Marcus hesitated. Then, in a tight voice, he said, You've been betrayed. Shaq's pulse quickened. By who? Marcus sighed. Someone close to you. Someone you trusted. Shaq gritted his teeth. Tell me. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then finally, he spoke. Daniel Ricks. Shaq froze. His mind raced. That didn't make sense. Daniel had been his biggest ally in this fight. The one person who had pushed him to go public. the one who had helped him dig into Vincent's past. But Marcus's voice was steady, certain. "He sold you out, Shaq," Marcus continued. "Vincent got to him. Either paid him off or threatened him, I don't know. But he's been feeding Holloway everything. Every move you've made. Every plan you had. That's why Vincent's always a step ahead." Shaq exhaled slowly, rage simmering beneath his skin. He had trusted Daniel. And now everything. The lawsuit, the media war, Lena's eviction. It had all been sabotaged from the inside. This wasn't just Vincent's game anymore. Now, it was personal. Shaq had learned a long time ago that power wasn't just about money. Real power was influence. Who controlled the story? Who dictated the rules? Who had the ability to shape public perception? For weeks, Vincent Holloway had controlled that narrative. He had manipulated the media, crushed opposition, and silenced anyone who dared to stand against him. But now, the cracks were starting to show. And Shaq was about to tear the whole thing down. It started with Daniel Ricks. After the betrayal, Shaq didn't go after him immediately. He waited. He watched. And he let Daniel's own guilt do the work. Daniel had expected Shaq to confront him, to explode in anger, to cut him off completely. Instead, Shaq did something worse. He ignored him. No calls, no messages, nothing. And that silence? It ate at Daniel more than any confrontation ever could. By the time Shaq finally agreed to meet him, Daniel was already unraveling. They sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, a stark contrast to the war that had been raging in the city. Daniel looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, fingers twitching against his coffee cup. Shaq leaned forward, his voice calm but unshakable. "Why'd you do it?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I didn't have a choice." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "There's always a choice." Daniel let out a shaky breath. "Vincent found out I was digging into his deals. He gave me an ultimatum. Either I work for him or I lose everything." He looked up, desperation in his eyes. "I have a family, Shaq." Shaq nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And Lena didn't?" Daniel winced. He had no answer for that. Shaq let the silence sit between them before finally speaking again. "You want to make this right?" Daniel nodded quickly. "Yes, anything." Shaq slid a folder across the table. "Then you're going to burn Vincent from the inside." Daniel hesitated before opening the folder. Inside were years of Vincent's financial records, bribes, offshore accounts, forged contracts, the kind of evidence that couldn't be ignored. Shaq had already done the work. Now Daniel was going to deliver the final blow. The next morning, the city woke up to a storm. A headline exploded across every major news outlet. "Exclusive, leaked documents, expose Vincent Holloway's illegal housing scandal." The article, written by Daniel Ricks himself, was brutal. It detailed everything: the fraudulent evictions, the corrupt officials, the money laundering. It wasn't just an expose, it was a death sentence. By noon, the mayor's office released a statement. A full investigation was being launched into Holloway Enterprises, and Vincent's assets were frozen pending review. By evening, protesters had swarmed Vincent's office, chanting his name like a curse. And by nightfall, his own allies started turning on him. Vincent sat in his penthouse office, watching the chaos unfold on the news. His hands were clenched into fists, his mind racing. He had always known that power was fragile, that the same people who praised you one day would abandon you the next. But he had never expected them to turn this fast. His phone buzzed. It was one of his longest-standing investors, a man who had backed him through every shady deal, every political bribe. "Vincent," the man's voice was tight. "We need to talk." Vincent took a slow breath. "We have nothing to talk about." "You don't get it," the man snapped. "This isn't just a scandal. This is criminal. The city is coming after you and no one wants to go down with you." Vincent's jaw tightened. "I made all of you rich. And now you're a liability." The call disconnected. Vincent exhaled, pressing his fingers to his temples. This wasn't supposed to happen, but somehow, someway. Shaquille O'Neal had beaten him. Shaq didn't celebrate. Even as Vincent's world collapsed. Even as the legal system finally moved against him. even as the eviction orders were officially canceled and families were allowed to return to their homes. Because for Shaq, the fight had never been about winning. It had been about justice. And justice always came with a cost. The cost came in the form of a quiet conversation with Lena Carter. Shaq found her in a small motel outside the city, where she had been hiding ever since Vincent's men forced her out. She looked tired, worn down in a way that went beyond just exhaustion. Shaq sat beside her, waiting for her to speak first. Finally, she sighed. "I don't think I can go back." Shaq frowned. "Lena, you don't have to be afraid anymore. Vincent's done. He's never coming back from this." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Maybe, but people like him, they always leave scars." Shaq didn't argue. He had seen it before. The damage that lingers, even after the fight is over. Lena looked up at him. "I appreciate everything you did, I really do. But my kids and I, we need a fresh start. Away from all this." Shaq nodded slowly. "I understand." And he did. Because sometimes, even after you win, you still have to walk away. Vincent Holloway was arrested 3 days later. The charges were stacked against him: fraud, racketeering, illegal property dealings. There was no escaping it. As Shaq watched the news, he thought about something Vincent had said once. "I don't fall, Shaq." But now, he had fallen so hard there was no coming back. Vincent Holloway had spent decades playing the game. A game where money was power, where laws were just obstacles to be bent, and where the weak were meant to be stepped on. And for years he had won. But in the end, it wasn't a rival billionaire, a political scandal, or a market crash that took him down. It was justice. And justice had a name: Shaquille O'Neal. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, former tenants, legal experts, everyone had come to watch the fall of Vincent Holloway. Vincent sat at the defense table, his once pristine suit wrinkled, his hands clasped together tighter than they ever had been. His lawyer was whispering in his ear, but he wasn't listening. Because he already knew. This was the end. The judge's voice rang through the room. On the charges of fraud, racketeering, illegal property dealings, and conspiracy to manipulate city housing laws. A pause. Vincent's breath caught in his throat. Guilty. The word echoed in his ears. There was no last-minute deal, no phone call that would make this go away. No corrupt official left to bail him out. Vincent Holloway, once untouchable, was now just another fallen king. The bailiff approached. Vincent's hands trembled as he was escorted out of the courtroom. No cameras followed him now, because no one cared about a man who had lost everything. The city moved on quickly. A week after Vincent's conviction, developers scrambled to distance themselves from him. Former allies denied ever working with him. Politicians who had once taken his money now pretended they had never heard his name. His properties were seized, his assets liquidated. His name, once spoken with power, was now a joke. Even the very system he had controlled for years was now eating him alive. That was the thing about power. It never truly belonged to you. The second you lose it, it turns against you. Shaq didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. Because this fight had never been about winning. It had been about doing the right thing. He walked through the neighborhood, the same streets Vincent had once tried to erase, and for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Lena wasn't there. She had left for a fresh start. But others had stayed. Families that had once lived in fear now laughed on their doorsteps. Children played in the streets, no longer worried about where they'd sleep next week. Shaq had done a lot of things in his life, won championships, built businesses, traveled the world. But this felt like the biggest win of all. Because at the end of the day, greed falls, power shifts. But doing the right thing? That lasts forever. Powerful men fall when good people stand up. This isn't just a story. It's a reminder that justice wins when we refuse to stay silent. Speak up, stay aware, and never let greed rewrite the rules of fairness.